Okay, today's session is best practices for recording and preserving oral histories. And this is going to be a session that primarily talks about some of the technical side of oral histories. And here we go. There we go. I found my cursor. So we're going to focus on things like recording, standards and recording tips, as well as preserving files once you've recorded them. My name is Josh Hogan. I'm the digital preservation archivist here at GSU, and you can see my email there if you need to get hold of me. So this presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part, we're going to look at recording equipment and tips, things like smartphones and apps, audio video equipment, audio editing software, and how to share your recordings. And the second part will pivot to digital preservation issues, like what is digital preservation? How does digital preservation work? What should you do to ensure that you preserve your files properly, and how to work with an archive. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is part one, and we'll start with maybe the easiest way that we all have to capture oral histories. I'm sure many of you, like me, have one of these in your pocket, and it can be it can be older, it can be beat up, but it's still useful. So if you have one of these, you can add a voice recorder app, and this gives you a versatile and powerful tool to record oral history interviews. It doesn't have to be top of the line. It can even be something like a lower budget phone, as long as it has the capability of having one of these apps on it. You can actually create a decently high quality audio track that can be easily saved and easily accessed by others and by yourself in the future. So speaking of the kinds of apps that you would need for a phone like this, you would want to choose one of the many on the markets. These are some of the probably more ubiquitous ones. Otter.ai is one that is probably quite familiar to many of you, or you may have heard of it. This is one that uses, I guess, an early form of artificial intelligence in order to create transcripts as people speak into the recorder. So this is a great one to get you started with creating a file that can be shared as a transcript once you clean it up. People estimate that on average, they're about 90% correct about what was said. So you definitely have to clean them up, but they do give you that beginning of a file. Easy Voice Recorder is another one that you can choose. This one is available to do podcasts, voice memos, and also, of course, conversations. Dolby On, another one that is a good possibility. That one gives you some noise reduction capabilities, as well as limiting any kind of sound issues without having to have specialized equipment. And finally, that last one that looks like a little tape, that one is known as Voice Recorder and Audio Editor. That one's an Android specific one. The good thing about that one is the app is completely free, and you can record as much as you want, as long as you have space on your phone. I should have mentioned with Otter, it's also got a free version, and you're limited to 250 minutes, which can be stored on the Otter cloud. But if you are going to use your phone for this purpose, there are some considerations that you need to take into account. One of those is that you really want to use a recording app that can record high resolution audio wherever possible. The highest resolution would mean something like a WAV or an OGG file, and you want to really have a minimum of a setting of 44 kilohertz and 16-bit recording. If you record to MP3, which is a more accessible format in terms of people being able to download it and use it, and a smaller data footprint, you want to make sure that you record at the highest bit rate possible on the app. The recommended standard is 190 kilobits per second or above, with the 44 kilohertz sampling rate. If possible, use an external microphone. You'd have to really do some research to see what will work with your phone and with the app. Remember to block any calls or disable any notifications during the interview, so you don't have to cut off. And also make sure that you have the required space on your phone or whatever area you're saving the file to, if you're going to do that. I'm not necessarily recommending to use your phone for video oral histories, but if you are going to do so, it is possible. You do need to invest in a tripod and possibly a lighting system if you're doing indoor recording. If you're going to do a short, high quality clip, it's probably a better use for a phone, unless you have some capability of saving into a cloud or saving into, say, a removable SD card. The tripod just keeps you from having all, how jerky it can be to use a phone to do recordings. In addition to apps on your phone, or your tablet or any other device, you can also use remote meeting software, just like we're using right here. And we're recording this session right now. Zoom is a great way to record interviews. You can see that there are many options from this slide about how to set up your recordings. You can display participants' names or not. You can add a timestamp to your recording, all that kind of thing. Zoom also allows you to add closed captioning or generate transcripts of what has been said so that you can get started towards other supporting files you might want to use. You could also use the screen sharing function like we're doing in this meeting so that you can show maybe documentation or pictures of the person you're interviewing, say in the period they're describing. It's just a way to enhance the final product if you're going to do video. Zoom's not the only app that you can use in this regard. You can also use WebEx or Teams or other tools if you're more familiar with those, but Zoom is probably the most ubiquitous and the most well-known, and it's quite easy to get started. Another thing I like about Zoom is that it generates recordings as MP4 files, which is one of the preferred formats that we collect here, as well as a preferred format for many of the online sharing services. One caveat is that paid versions provide more options for you. So if you're going to use Zoom in this capacity and use it a lot, you may want to invest in the paid version, which is not that expensive, but it's just something to consider. Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about some of the lower budget or easier ways to get started, we can talk a little bit about some of the equipment that you might consider if you want to invest in something with a little bit more functionality. If you have a budget for this kind of thing and you want a high quality audio recording, one of the things that would be good to use would be a Tascam. This is the Tascam DR05X. This is a good low priced version that they offer. It can record both WAV files and MP3 files. So you have both the higher end preservation copy, which is the WAV, and you have a smaller MP3 that you can share. So that's great because these are portable. They have the option to add omnidirectional microphones. They have USB in and out for Mac and PC. And also they are highly efficient in power. You can get 17.5 hours of operation from 2 AA batteries, or up to that, obviously, depending on how intensely you use it. And it supports SD cards for extension of storage. But you don't have to just be limited to that one option. If you want to explore other options that you could purchase, a great place to get started is the Ask Doug webpage at Oral History in the Digital Age. And this is a page that allows you to actually add in your budget, what kind of level you want it to record at, and whether or not it's best in field. You can set those different parameters and do a search, and you'll get a result that looks something like this. So in this case, I searched for options that are under $300, but I want professional level quality. I want something that's considered best in class, and I can get a sort of a mini review of this. And then now I know I can go search for this and see if I can find it for purchase at the Tascam website or whichever company is carrying this particular model. So now that we've talked a little bit about recording these audio files, I want to have a word about audio file formats and the size that is involved. You can see that there are different sizes depending on the type of file you choose and the level of definition that you choose. So in the top one, you can see that you have an MP3 at a relatively high rate of 320 kilobits per second. Remember I said before that 190 is kind of the minimum standard that most people are looking for, or at least ideally looking for. So you can see that if you do it at the higher 320, you're already an hour's worth of video is going to cost you 144 megabytes in your storage. But if you go ahead and go up to the next level, which is a wave, the lowest level of a wave file, which is going to be 16-bit, 44 kilohertz, and only a mono track, that's going to double your storage needs, or more than double your storage needs. And again, as you go up in levels of definition, you're going to have a larger and larger file. So the important point to take away about this is that if you're going to have the intention of long-term storage and preservation of your files, and we'll talk about that in the next half, you need to balance the quality and the quantity. If you have a lot of, a long recording, you probably don't want to have the gold standard unless you can afford to purchase a lot of storage space for your files. So back to the equipment. Many of the recorders available for this field use have built-in microphones, but it is a good practice to purchase a higher quality microphone if you have the budget for it. We recommend an omnidirectional microphone. You can get it from companies like Shure or Electro Voice, and that microphone should have an XLR cable connection. This would connect well with that Tascam that I showed you earlier. We don't recommend the sort of clip-on microphones. There's a lot of noise that can be picked up with those. This particular example that's in the photograph here is a $45 setup. So it's not that prohibitively expensive. The great thing about a model like this is it tends to guard against things like wind noise, less popping from your P's and your T's and your B sounds. And you also have less handling noise, and you can use these upside down as well as right side up. So they're very useful in field recording if you can add one to your kit. So we haven't really talked much about video yet, but I wanted to bring that up. Video cameras and equipment, I'm not going to give a particular recommendation, but I will say these are the kinds of things that you should look for if you're going to buy a video camera. You want to make sure that it has that microphone input with the XLR connection, headphone monitoring, high definition recording, removable cards for extension of your storage, mountability on a tripod. And the big thing is you want to make sure that you have access to, or the ability to record in popularly supported video formats. Video changes a lot more than audio does. So, and we'll talk a little bit about the constituent pieces of the file, but you want to make sure that any camera that you purchase would have support for something like H.264, AVC, DV, MPEG-2, MPEG-4. For more, these would be, I think, basic ones that are often used in the field, and you can really find out more about that by looking at the link below. But if you can make sure that this list of things is available at a minimum, it's probably going to be a usable camera for you. So now we'll have a little word about video files. Video files are more complex than audio files, whereas a WAV file is one file that just brings the audio track to you. A video file is really multiple components. You have a wrapper that wraps the whole thing together. You have a video track and you have an audio track. So you have to make sure that the wrapper is something that is also currently accessible. Common wrappers available are .mov, .avi, .mpg, and .wmv. These are ones that you will see a lot and are also readable by a lot of the software out there. The codec is the coder and decoder. It's kind of technical, but that's the same thing that I mentioned before, that a camera should be able to tell you whether or not it records in at least one or two of these codecs. The other thing to mention about video files, because they are complex, they're much bigger than audio files, which just stands to reason. So if you do an hour's worth of high definition video, it can range anywhere from 2 or 3 gigabytes to over 25 gigabytes if you're doing 4K. So again, you have to think about balancing what you want to do with the quality and the visual aspect of it with what you can actually store for the long haul and share easily. So here, I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the softwares that you have available for editing. For example, for audio, these are not the only ones you have, but some of the more commonly used ones are Audacity, Adobe Audition, and GarageBand, which is more of a Mac product. Audacity is the one that I would recommend for most people because it's freely available. It's open source. It's cross-platform, so it's not stuck on one kind of machine. And it doesn't really cost anything to download it and start working with it. This is a screenshot of what you will encounter if you open up a file on Audacity. You can see that it gives you the 2 stereo tracks, the timing. You can go in and try to enhance things if they don't sound right. You can cut things out if you just want to create a clip. There are all kinds of different features that you can do. You can also see at the bottom that there, you can see the project rate and where you are in the index. So it's a very useful software that doesn't cost anything. So anyway, somehow I've lost my video file. So I don't have a slide for that. I made a slide for video software. Some of the ones that you might choose for that, and I'm sorry that I don't have a representation of that, so you can see what I'm talking about. But for video sharing, video editing files, video editing software, you can choose something like Adobe Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve. There are also some online ones like Canva that you can use that allow you to freely edit online if you don't have the budget to buy one of the pay softwares like Resolve or Premiere Pro. So sharing your oral history recordings. So now you've created all these recordings, you've used your equipment, you've edited it the way you want it to. Now you want to share it. There are many different ways to share it. Some of these are free and online. Some of them you might have to download. But for audio, SoundCloud is a good choice. YouTube is also a good choice. It will, you can just put up an image and have the audio file play with an image on the in place of the video. Vimeo is another place, and of course iTunes. Omeka and OMS are something that is used probably more widely in the library field, but they are freely available to download. Omeka is an online software, a software that allows you to create an online exhibit or an online site, a collection of video or audio or images. OMS is the oral history metadata synchronizer, and this allows for you to index your metadata to the video itself. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see an example of that from us. This is one of our oral histories from the Great Speckled Bird, Nan Oryx oral history interview. And below you can see that there's a time index. You can click through to different areas and synchronize the video with what part of it you want to listen to. So it gives you an ability to share both the whole video and allow people to see the clips that they want to see. So that's, I know, a whirlwind overview of that, but I wanted to go ahead and pivot to the preserving oral history section of the presentation, so we can make sure we touch on all of that. So let's talk a little bit about digital preservation. First of all, digital preservation is not equal to technology or software. That's not the point of digital preservation. Technology is an essential piece of building a program to preserve, your files, but unless you have the program set up, it's not really going to help you. Digital preservation is about the system that you put in place, or that your organization puts in place, and the people who are responsible for making that system function properly. It's about thinking holistically about how we make the digital assets in our care survive for as long as possible. This diagram is included here because I think it illustrates the fact that there's a lot of other supporting pieces that are holding up what you see. We see the technology, the platform that allows us to watch the video, or the site that allows us to download it, but we don't see all the other things like our models of how we're going to run our system, and everything in the background, and the structure and the people involved who make it happen. So just think about, just put that, I guess, keep that in mind as we go ahead. This is really about a system. And that system includes 5 key areas: storage, integrity, control, metadata, and content. Storage is the thing that I think most of us think about when we think about digital preservation. Where are we going to store all this stuff? So you need to have a plan. How many copies are you going to keep? Where will you keep them? How will you, and then once you've got that in place, how are you going to check to make sure that the files have, they aren't corrupted, they haven't suffered from bit rot, they haven't got a virus, all those things. So storage, integrity go together, fit together, and need to both be taken into account. Control is the documentation of all the actions you've taken on your files. You know where you've put them, you know when they were recorded, you know how they relate to the rest of the collection. Metadata is the data about your files, the information like names, titles, descriptions, summaries. And finally, content is really an understanding of the types of file formats that you have, you know, what kind of audio formats you have, what kind of visual formats, what kind of text formats, so that you can maintain them over the years. And there are also, I think, 5 general steps that you can take to make sure all of these 5 areas are taken care of. So this is really, I think, more practical than the more systematic talk, the theory behind digital preservation systems. So the 5 steps are identify, document, organize, store and backup, and finally maintain. And we're going to talk about each of those in turn. So for identify, decide at the beginning of the project which categories of files are important to save for the long term. Materials that are commonly preserved for oral history projects include video recordings, audio recordings, transcripts, photographs, project planning records, and release forms. Decide whether you will save every version of a file or just the final version or the best version. Often people will save both the highest quality version of a file, such as the WAV or a preservation copy. They'll also save a less high quality file like an MP3 as an access file that you can upload to SoundCloud or YouTube. So this is just an example of the kinds of files that you can accumulate when you're dealing with oral histories, release forms, the templates that you use to email potential interviewees, that kind of thing. So getting a grip on all these is what the identify step is about. So document. This second step is, again, builds on the first. You want to keep a thorough log of all interviews you conduct and recordings you save, along with key information that will help you or future users of those recordings understand the context and any unique issues or characteristics. In addition to copies of release forms or other paperwork, consider keeping information related to every interview that you have in say in a spreadsheet. You can see here that information includes anything from project title to the file names of the recordings, the links of the recordings, explanations of any restrictions for sharing that there might be, that kind of thing. It's important to build on your identify step by this crucial second step. And the third step is also intimately related, and that is to organize your materials. So you want to decide how to organize and name your files and folders at the very beginning of the project if possible, or as early as possible in the process. It's easier to maintain an organizational system than to create one after you've accumulated lots of material. Take that from someone who's done it. So it's good to really have that idea in mind already. Name your individual files in a way that is consistent and makes the content of each one clear. For example, you can use interviewee name underscore interviewee date. So it could be like Smith John underscore 0101 2023.wave. And that tells you it's John Smith on January 1st, 2023. This goes along with the identifying document steps because that helps you build the whole structure of how you're going to keep this collection together. So you can ask questions like, will you have a folder for each interview with subfolders for access file and preservation files, or will you put all of the files together in one appropriately named folder? There's no one size fits all, but you should be consistent within the system that you choose. Store and backup. You can see this is actually really more of a later step. You've got to have everything else in place first, but you do have to have a plan for storage and backup. And the reason why I say both store and backup is that they're not really the same thing, although they're the same step. Storage is something that can happen without a backup. So you want to both store your original files somewhere and have at least one backup, if not more, somewhere else. So the advice is really designate a central storage location for all materials and regularly consolidate relevant files from your recording equipment, your phone, your camera, or any other files that you have related from your email account, thumb drive, Dropbox, etc. Back up these files frequently using an automated process if you can, but if not, manually. Even if you share your oral histories online via social media, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your own website, you should preserve the original files somewhere else. Websites can disappear, companies can go bankrupt, things can disappear. So ideally, you should plan to keep 3 copies of your files using at least 2 different types of storage media. For example, one on your computer, one on an external hard drive, and one in a cloud storage account. Could be something that would be an easily workable system. At least one copy should be stored in a different physical or geographical location from the others. I know it's not always possible, to store something in another geographical location, but as far away from the others is good. If your house burns down, if you have one stored somewhere else in your office or at a friend's house, then you don't lose everything. To satisfy this requirement, you could also use cloud backup because the cloud servers could be anywhere. Remember to periodically update or replace each copy. Make sure that they still have integrity, as we talked about before. If you see any bit rot or corruption, you should replace anything like that with a copy that is healthy. And you want to make sure that everything contains the latest version and the latest copy of your work. And the final step is maintain. All hard drives crash eventually, so plan to replace your backup devices, every 5 years or so. Just as WordStar files and WordPerfect documents are now difficult to use, today's standard formats will probably eventually become obsolete because these file formats and technologies change over time. You should spot check your files to make sure they still work and that they're still the kinds of formats that are accessible to people. So those 5 steps together make for a more systematic approach to digital preservation. So finally, I guess the question is, why do we do all this? Why do we go to this trouble? If we just upload things to YouTube and have something saved on our computer, why isn't that enough? And I think really, for me, the answer is always access. Access is the key concept here, in the sense that if we're not providing access to files to people who need to see them, and it might be that your oral history project is just about your family having access to it, and that's fine. but you want to make sure that those people who should have access, and it's there for the long haul. So if we don't do the other steps in the process, such as, preservation tasks or making sure that they've been properly analyzed and appraised for whether they should be in our collection, if those things don't get done, access sometimes suffers. So I think we have to see it as a bigger systematic or programmatic kind of picture. So it might be possible that if you do an oral history project that you will eventually work with an archival repository, such as Special Collections and Archives, or any other archival repository where you might store the eventual final copy of all of the files. And so there are several pieces of that you need to know about. Appraisal and accessioning. This is something that archives are going to do to make sure that these collections belong with them. The arrival of interviews at a repository is one of the most critical junctures in an interview's life cycle. So the appraisal is determining which of these interviews should be accepted by a repository, and accessioning are the actions that archivists take to acquire legal and physical custody of the interviews. Metadata and description are also important because this is the kind of information that makes us understand what the context of your files are, what kind of project they were part of, who these people were that you interviewed, why you were interviewing them, dates, everything that goes along with describing the files that are there. Again, preservation is something that we take on responsibility in archives for the files that we accept and take on. So we want to make sure that we have all the information to do all these preservation tasks that I've just been talking about. Also having conversations about access, who gets to access these files, what are the legal restrictions, anything like that. And of course, it's, we also often collaborate with others to build oral history projects. An example is We Love Buford Highway. We've worked with them to create some oral history interviews. So that's a possibility sometimes with people who are collecting oral histories. And again, at the end of the day, you really have to spell out who has ownership, who has rights to the files if you're working with an archives. So I just wanted to swing back to the file formats. If you are going to work with the archives, remember that archives also have limitations on how much we can store. And I'm just putting this back up here to again show you that since there are many different files that are involved in oral history, you have to be aware of making sure that the collection is I guess, what's the word I'm really looking for, is something that can be stored by the archives or repository that you're working with. If they can't accommodate lots of giant gold standard files, that can be problematic. Same thing with the video files, making sure that they have common wrappers, common codecs, and that they are playable by modern contemporary software. So here, I just want to give some time for questions. But before I do that, here's some of the resources that I referenced throughout the course of the presentation. Oral History in the Digital Age, that's where the Ask Doug site was. The Oral History Association's Manual of Best Practices is going to give you not just recording and preservation tips, but also the entire process of oral history. Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky, they created the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer and are very heavily involved in oral history and advancing oral history. And Digital Omnium also has a lot of information on oral history projects. So that's my presentation, and I will open up the floor for any questions.